he has been able to again, speak to the middle ground of South Africa. And that is in both black and white. I mean, if one listens to, talk radio stations, which is not necessarily, a broad, one can't make a broad analysis of that because, of course, it's middle-class South Africans who listen to talk radio. But having said that, you do hear black and white from across the country acknowledging that Cyril Ramaphosa is the man to vote for. And I think that is quite interesting, especially from your sort of white audience that we've known the white population have overwhelmingly voted for the Democratic Alliance, giving them, of course, over that 20% of the vote. But I think, the sort of postscript to that is, of course, well, if you're going to not do that, then we're going to allow the economic freedom fighters to come into power. And that, of course, will, really challenge the dominant capitalist sort of environment that South Africa operates in. And so, Cyril Ramaphosa, internal ANC polls have shown that Cyril Ramaphosa is indeed a very popular figure. If you just put him alone, he would be able to get support from South Africans. But I think the ANC, of course, are also quite conservative. And so ANC leaders have indicated, look, they will be totally happy if they get 55%. If there's anything more, well, they will, be dancing and holding, having lots of parties across the country. But that's conservatively what they want, because, of course, I think the 2016 election was really a shock. That the ANC core, an example which we wrote about in the Africa Report, Soweto, not turning up to vote at all.
Crystal,
and that's the kind of
the most
shift
important
that they want to do.
The most important question, how is your mother going to vote in May?
That's quite interesting because my mother is still undecided who to vote for. She is not convinced by the ANC. She's not convinced by the DA. And she might be convinced by Patricia de Lille. And it's more just because Patricia de Lille talks about local issues. She's a woman from Cape Town, so she's able to speak the language that my mother, a working class woman from the Cape Flats, wants to hear. However, my father, I had brought back some ANC paraphernalia from the ANC anniversary event that we covered for the Africa Report, and he's been wearing it as he walks, in different parts of the Cape Flats, in Mitchell's Plain, etc. And he is met by total anger, with people questioning why is he wearing this ANC cap? Why would he vote for this party? Because he says people are so disgusted what they hear on a daily basis at the state capture hearing, because here people are trying to simply have $2 to buy a bread and buy electricity, and yet when you switch on TV, radio, or open a newspaper, you are inundated by millions of dollars that were simply stolen from the taxpayer. So for working class people in Cape Town, clearly the ANC, from what my father is getting on the street, they are not very happy with, the African National Congress. But again, we do have very low voter turnout in Cape Town, so people might just be too disgusted to even go out and vote.
He sounds like a very brave man, nonetheless. Well, Patrick, on that accountability front, there had been talk, I think, of lifestyle audits, about asset declarations. What do you think we'll see will be the impact of these public hearings on corruption that are all about to come home to roost, and these sort of more personal things like lifestyle audits? I know, Julius Malema of the EFF has his own opinions, and people have their own opinions about him when it comes to lifestyle audits.
Well, funnily enough, I remember an interview with Jacob Zuma when he was in London. It must have been about 4 or 5 years ago. They were talking about actually preparations for the South Africa's hosting of the World Cup and so on. And two things came out of that press conference. First of all, was a question on lifestyle audits. And he said, this is exactly what we need to do. He said some of the cadres in the ANC have become extremely indisciplined, and we really need to bring back that sense of a popular people's movement. That is why we're going to institute lifestyle audits. He was absolutely categorical that he was 100% in support of them, and he would be first in line to have his lifestyle audited. The second thing was someone piped up from the back and said, I have a very difficult question for you, Mr. President. What on earth can you do about the terrible state, and then there was a pause, of South Africa's football team, and everyone burst out laughing. But that seemed to be more important than the lifestyle audits, because it certainly got a much longer answer. I mean, I think Crystal's description of the mood on the Cape Flats is absolutely critical to understanding where Ramaphosa is on this issue of accountability. I mean, it doesn't matter that he's inherited a mess. As they say, it's just 6 months an incoming government has to deal with the economic crisis and the corruption scandals it inherits from its predecessor. He's had that. He's had 2 lots of 6 months already. So I think people are pretty frustrated that they're not seeing enough. I was in South Africa. Actually, Crystal and I met up and we went to some of these events together, and that was very much the message. People were saying, you've been there for a year. I mean, we're just seeing these commissions now. We're talking about billions of rand going west. Yet our basic services are being cut. Our schools are a mess. I went to a wedding in Johannesburg about a month ago, and was actually fun. It was full of teachers, and they were all, again, hardline ANC people in the liberation days. Today they're saying we've been betrayed. So there's a real anger about that, and the commissions just are pretty surreal. I mean, I think from an outsider's point of view, it looks fantastic. You've got a commission on the tax fraud that's gone on with the capture of the South African Revenue Service. You've got the commission on the Public Investment Corporation, the biggest state-owned pension fund in Africa, or public investment fund in Africa, and you've got the Zondo Commission itself on all the particulars of state capture. That's a great process, and it is a good example of how effective South African institutions are. But without that political sense of urgency, they're not delivering for people. I mean, people really want to see some sentences being handed out, not in a sort of petty vengeance way, but they're saying, look, this is just going to go on. I think the last point I'd make on this is Ramaphosa's own position as the deputy to Zuma. Of course, it's the easiest hit on Ramaphosa in the world to say, where were you when all this was happening? Why didn't you raise any issues? Why didn't you stonk off? At least, why didn't you sort of sneak information? Whatever he did or didn't do in those days, it wasn't very much, people feel. Now he's president. They expect him to sort of make up for that. And I think that's going to be a frustration. And if, as Crystal's saying, the mood on the Cape Flats, but certainly elsewhere in the countries, Cyril's come back is certainly an improvement on what we had, but we're not yet convinced. I mean, you could see an election with a low turnout, and the ANC may get its 55%. I mean, the pollsters, as I said, think they might even get 60. But if it's on a low turnout, it just shows you how disillusioned the voters really are.
I think that's absolutely correct, Patrick, because one example, for instance, of course, as you say, the fact that we have these commissions and we hearing straight from executives the extent of the capture that had happened at institutions, and millions of South African government pensioners are completely stressed out watching and hearing how the Public Investment Corporation, which is Africa's largest asset manager, have been playing Russian roulette with their money. And I've spoken to a number of government officials, teachers, nurses, and they tell me straight up they want to resign because they want their money. They just don't trust that they will get their pension when they eventually retire in 20, 30 years. And that is the level of distrust that people have. And of course, they welcome the fact that they're now hearing the extent of the rot at these institutions. But they're simply saying, but what about us? You know, we've worked for 20 odd years for government and we expect to get our pension when we retire. Will that pension still be there? And that is what Cyril Ramaphosa has to deal with. And there's some issues that we wonder, where is Ramaphosa? And one of them is, for instance, the fight between the Minister of Police, Bheki, and the former head of the police sort of investigative internal arm, IPID, which is Robert McBride. Both, ironically, ANC cadres, both. I mean, Robert McBride was on death row for what he felt was, part of his, belief in the African National Congress, that bombing, of course, in KwaZulu-Natal. And so, of course, Bheki also, from KZN. And there was just a whole sort of outrage around why is McBride not being reappointed as the head? Why is Bheki not renewing? And what is behind it? And of course, there's been different reports coming out that it's two big egos fighting it out. And of course, Bheki is the minister, or is it the fact that Robert McBride has been touching on some sensitive issues within the policing unit? And I had spoken to someone very senior that's been watching all of this and knows intimately what's happening within the policing. And he was like, what is happening is really worrying, because it does seem that, there's some things that Cyril is focusing on and there's other things that is not. And policing, for instance, is one of those issues where it almost seems that Bheki is being left to his own devices. But there's just no focus on that, because our focus is too much on what's happening within the state capture environment, what's happening within Eskom, what's happening with the Public Investment Corporation, because it just seems there's so many competing interests vying for Cyril's time that he's just not able to keep track and keep his eye on everything happening in South Africa.
So I think you're absolutely right, and I think maybe that popular anger is not something that's going to go away quickly, and maybe we will see political realignments happening in South Africa faster than we expect. In any case, Crystal, thanks very much. Really appreciate it. When we'll be speaking to you very soon.
Thank you.
Patrick, maybe we could stick on this idea of popular anger just for a minute or two, because there's been obviously a big uprising in Sudan.
Yeah.
Students have now linked with other parts of society in what is a really fundamental threat to the regime in Sudan. And next door but one, Algeria, is also looks like the flutterings, the early beginnings of quite substantial uprisings there, even if they're not, we're not in sort of uprising territory as we knew it in Egypt 4 years ago. What is this? What features can we see to this popular anger in these two countries?
I think the really interesting thing about this is that popular anger kind of sums it up. But I think the proximate causes are pretty different. You said, Sudan is this militarized Islamist regime which seized power in 1989, and it's taken 3 decades, to get to this. But this is where we are now, and a lot of wars in between. But the odd thing about it is that the logical thing maybe in the end, it was the economy that did it. The economy is broken utterly. partly because of a concession that the Sudanese regime made to try and get back in the good books of the West and cut its end the sanctions regimes by ceding the right of South Sudan to have the referendum and then break away, get its independence, and end that war between what is now South Sudan and the Khartoum regime. They made that concession, and they lost 2/3 of their oil receipts into the bargain. And that was back 5-6 years ago. The economy hasn't recovered since then. But instead, what has happened with the remaining